Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I want to welcome you to this month's P&G Alumni Network Enrichment Series webinars. I'm your host, Ileana Rojas, and I hope you're all safe and well. Today, we have a wonderful guest, but before I introduce him, we want to start a conversation. I want to tell you about the Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest today, Dan Rajczak. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll let you introduce yourself while we shift screens. And let me give you change presenter views. Okay.
All right, let's see if I can do this. It looks like it's coming through.
Yeah, it is.
Very
there
good.
we go.
Thank you, Ileana, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. This is Dan Rajczak, and it's just a pleasure to be with you and to be asked to share some of my experiences with fellow P&G alumni. I'll say at the outset, I got to qualify my thoughts that they just reflect my own experiences and biases. And when we talk about particularly private industry, and in this case, working in private equity, experiences can be quite different. So, others may have different experiences. And then I wanted to share some of my own thoughts. A little bit of background. I was 26 years at Procter & Gamble, and I'm sure like all of you, I look back with gratitude upon a diverse career path with so many great stretching experiences through the way, but also great mentors and coaches that are so fundamental to our development and our own leadership development. I started in Canada back in the day. I actually started as a young chemical engineer in research and development in the mid 80s, and at that time Canada was a subsidiary quite independent from the US. In fact, was aligned with international, and probably from a management standpoint had more in common with Latin America and Japan than it did in the US. So it was an interesting environment to grow up for me, and it was an independent subsidiary, the biggest one outside of the US. And I started in R&D in laundry, and because of that subsidiary nature, I was part of a multifunctional team, and early on felt broad exposure to the end-to-end business model and working with all the functions in the company. So while my early roots were in innovation, and I worked particularly on Tide in those days, I became interested in the business strategy and the operational side of the business through the multifunctional team interaction. And I was fortunate to have some really supportive sponsorship and helped me transfer into brand marketing after about 5 years with the company, and had brand management experiences in laundry and paper in Canada. And then I ultimately transferred to the US in the mid 90s. And that was back in the days before there were global business units on a P&L basis. The business was still very much run regionally as profit centers, but the company did set up small strategy groups on the largest categories to really help coherent global category strategy and support category expansions into new geographies and new white space. I became the marketing director for global laundry, but much of my time was focused on expanding our foundational laundry business into the developing markets, places like the southern Latin America, southern cone of Latin America. You think about Brazil, Argentina, Chile. That was all Unilever country at that time, and it was white space for P&G. And similarly in Asia, India was new, and that was Unilever country. We were just getting going in China in laundry. That was through a very complex myriad of government-backed joint ventures and local brands to get in. And I also helped support the white space expansion or greenfield expansion into Pakistan. So it was very interesting times in terms of development of the company. And through that, I ultimately transferred to Japan as the general manager for Northeast Asia business, so Japan and South Korea. And at that time, it was really the emphasis on taking a very narrow brand and category portfolio and expanding the full complement of our household and laundry businesses and brands. It was a fun time, a very dynamic time. I came back to the US after that to run the company's corporate new business development group, really focused on developing new businesses for the company, but also supporting innovation, the corporate innovation funded programs across the company. It was really the early days of what has now become P&G Ventures. So very externally focused, sort of new business model, new category development focus. After that, I ran pet care, and that was in the period after the initial IAMS acquisition, sorting out what to do next with the business. And I also picked up what was the last of the human food businesses, if you will, in the snacks or Pringles business, where the view was really to maximize the value to the company through a divestiture, which we ultimately did with Kellogg's, the sale to Kellogg's. So I give you that a little bit of a background in which I feel blessed to have had quite a diverse set of experiences while rooted in R&D and product innovation, which I continue to love today, but with operational roles internationally, strategic roles, those that involved external partnerships and deals, as well as global category roles. So it left me with a strong interest in strategy development and direction, but also, frankly, a real passion for the operational side of the business and staying close to the day-to-day cut and thrust of the business. So when I left P&G, I was quite interested in and many people do, think about the world of private equity as an opportunity to get involved in transforming mid-sized businesses, bringing that experience and leadership capability that you achieve at P&G to help transform those businesses, create value, and frankly, participate in that value. And because they tend to be smaller, flatter organizations, a chance to guide the strategy, but also stay close and participate in the cut and thrust and execution of the business right through the customer connection. So as I say, it brought me to private equity, and I'll say at the outset that not all private equity is the same. People will tell you that. And it really is about aligning and finding private equity institutions that you can relate to, that you can develop a strong relationship with, and you're simpatico with their view of how to create value with their portfolio companies. It brought me to the business I lead today, and it's amazing. I've been almost 6 years now leading the totes-Isotoner company, which is a global company, but we have our biggest business here in the U.S. We have strong businesses in Europe, namely France and the UK, of course, in businesses like this, which are really in the accessories and weather protection products. Much of it is made in Asia and in China. So we have a strong sourcing development organization based in China and the Philippines. But I was attracted to this business for a couple of reasons. These are iconic brands. Maybe people can remember these businesses from years gone by. Totes has kind of invented the folding umbrella and stands for, it's really the only brand people can think of when they think about an umbrella. And similarly, Isotoner, many people can remember the advertising of Dan Marino back in the 80s and the Isotoner gloves. It's really synonymous with gloves and slippers. But as I came into this business, these were brands that were probably better known amongst the previous generation, and the opportunity to reinvent and represent these to the next generation, and also to recognize that the retail environment has shifted so dynamically. The businesses grew up in the department stores over decades, and everybody sort of appreciates that the department store has certainly been under fire, consolidating, shrinking, and the consumer behavior around shopping has changed dramatically. Not just obviously the move to e-commerce and direct selling, but many of these categories, from umbrellas to gloves and slippers, have really moved to the mass retail markets, and so a real chance to shift the business model. And as well, while all of these products have a certain fashion and style requirement, they also have a very big functional requirement when you think about rain and moisture protection and comfort. And so from an innovation and technology standpoint, a real opportunity to ramp that up, to differentiate, especially since more and more retail customers where they're sold are also competitors. Nobody has as big a sourcing and development capability as Walmart, and hence the need for differentiating innovation. And so that brought me to totes-Isotoner a number of years ago with a real mandate to try to transform the company. But the other aspect is maybe little known, is that this is a Cincinnati institution. The totes business actually started in the Cincinnati area in Loveland in the 20s, so almost 100 years of history. And similarly, the Isotoner brand has that kind of history, but a real a local connection, which to me was important, especially, you know, that this company has supported the community and so many people in their livelihoods over the years. It's amazing. Last year, we had a gentleman retire who was running our warehouse with 55 years of service, and we have many people with that kind of service. So in such a dynamic environment where there are challenges, you know, I saw the opportunity to ensure that the key role was to ensure that this was an enduring institution for the next generation as well. And one of the elements therein too, and it's certainly a big lever these days at P&G, is the notion of sustainability, and a real purpose-driven aspect to our company, because these categories, whether it's umbrellas or frankly slippers and apparel, unfortunately, I would say lag behind in their view to sustainability. When you think about what happens after you wear a shoe or something you no longer want to use, it generally lands up in landfill. And there's not nearly as well developed an end-to-end system to either recycle, reuse, or minimize the environmental impact. So we've been on a real charge to change that, from everything from using completely recycled materials to upcycling and reclaiming fabrics from landfill and using them in product, to a real push to looking at the nature of the industry, even in Asia, where it has such a high energy usage, water usage, driving for things like waterless printing and the like. So all of these things also appealed to me as an opportunity within the Cincinnati community to drive the business forward as we go. But nothing could have fully prepared me for some of the differences in managing private equity. I get asked a lot about the transition from P&G to private equity, because people seem to be very interested in that for many of the same reasons. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes and maybe draw some contrasts between the two that has led to a lot of my learning, and maybe share a few of my own stories in it. But first of all, there's no question to me, the experiences, the opportunities, and the coaching we received at P&G help to underpin foundational leadership qualities that are transferable anywhere. In fact, are highly leverageable in new business context. There's lots of institutional training at P&G, of course, and necessary, because historically it's been essentially a develop from within company. But I've always felt that it's been the learn by doing culture that is the biggest accelerant, if you like, in leadership development, where we know from early days we get thrown into new roles with high expectations, and your learning is accelerated because you got to get it done. And just as much as you learn from successes, you learn by mistakes and missteps. I can tell you, reflecting on my own experience, and one of the most formative things was when I joined the company as a young 22-year-old chemical engineer, responsible for Tide formulation in Canada. It was a 50-share brand. It was kind of the company jewels. And right from the get-go, I joined, had several direct reports, for the first time reporting to me. And my manager charged me with a significant reformulation to improve the cleaning performance, but also the whole sudsing and rinsing profile of the product, and working with a multifunctional team that were kind of depending on me to lead and carry out that development work. And there wasn't really a playbook for it. I mean, there was certainly lots of support, but I found myself traveling to the U.S. and finding technology experts and getting help in developing the right chemistries and ultimately pushing it through. And I can't tell you from early days how that set my mind in terms of what expectations were, but also what was possible. And I think that plays through in a big company like P&G with the footprint that it has, and just reflecting on my own experience, how diverse the opportunities are to accelerate one's learning, whether it's crossing functions like I did, or getting involved in new product categories, responsibilities in new geographies where the competitive context is completely different, cultural norms are different, right through to increasingly the opportunity to get involved in new business models, whether it's direct to consumer and e-commerce, or increasingly getting involved in the service side as a total company experience. To me, these are all within the P&G fold opportunities to accelerate one's leadership. And of course, you know, in a company like P&G with the foundation that it has, terrific tools and learning and strategic development and frameworks for deployment and operational processes. But I will say that for me, in transferring to new venues, new company situations, the focus on the purpose, values, and principles, or PVP, and how inculcated they are, and something that binds all P&G people together in terms of how decisions are made thoughtfully and doing the right thing. That is something you don't find everywhere, so deeply rooted, and is for me has been one of the most leverageable and powerful aspects, especially moving into smaller companies with varied and different backgrounds, for people to demonstrate first and foremost rooting in purpose and doing the right thing. I think is something that is invaluable that we get through our P&G training. So I just thought that, you know, at the outset, these to me are just foundational leadership experiences that carry well. But also there are some contrasts when you think about the experience growing up in a large public company versus the differences once one moves into private, smaller companies, especially private equity. Thinking about P&G, which, you know, is almost, you know, a couple hundred years old now, goes without saying that the time horizon on the business is certainly for the long term. Got to meet the near-term goals, you know, quarterly results, but there's a much greater emphasis in the long-term sustained value creation in the company. In fact, I can remember when I joined in the 80s, of course, we reported quarterly results, but we actually didn't give forward-looking guidance. It was really dependent upon the proven ongoing track record of the company, as well as the latest results for investors to make their decisions. Of course, that's changed fundamentally. There's a whole industry built around forecasting and PR to the investment community. That's just the nature of the beast. But I think that certainly the long-term horizon continues to be the focus, and it's underpinned by the most primary success measures of the company, whether it's the earnings per share, expanding market share and margins, and the consistent return of cash to shareholders through the yield or dividend. These are all the measures of the long-term and continued sustained success of the company. The other aspect I think that is very different and defining about such a large and successful company like P&G is that it carries a very, very low debt level. It borrows very little, and it's not necessarily borrow for the immediate term. And it's because the business is such a strong generator of cash. Virtually all the profit is converted into cash, and the company is able to both self-fund critical investments, brand investments, innovation investments, and fund the return to cash to shareholders. And you know, candidly, this is one area that because the company is so cash positive, cash and debt are generally managed at the corporate level. It's very, you know, it has very little focus, I would argue, in the day-to-day operational level of each business, especially down in the category level. And for me, as I'll talk about, that's one of the biggest differences in moving into private business that one has to learn, and learn very fast. Of course, P&G carries a very large stakeholder base, has, you know, many thousands of shareholders, both institutional and individual or retail, and involving in so many markets, has a great responsibility and connection to governments and communities, and increasingly as one moves up the management chain and gets you know, bigger roles in geographies, that takes on a larger part of their time, and of course has a very significant reporting requirement and regulatory requirement in communication, and a lot of effort and resource is got to be dedicated to the communication and reporting side of the business. If I contrast that to private equity, the biggest differences, which ultimately require and have required for me the biggest learning, is first and foremost the time horizon is much shorter. Private equity companies come and invest in a new business with a view to typically hold it, in an average of 3 to 5 years, and then they seek to multiply their investment through a transaction, and they're typically looking to increase the return on their equity investment, by some 3 times or more. So if they invest $250 million, let's say, in the purchase of a company, in the equity portion of their company, they're looking to exit it through a transaction with, call it $750 million, if you like. So the whole emphasis is, of course, is on making the right investments over time that will have a quick return and generate increased earnings, or EBITDA in this particular case, which is really the earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation and amortization. But it's really a proxy for how much cash the company is generating. And it's the pace of growth and the magnitude of that EBITDA over the time that they're holding it, which ultimately supports the valuation the company can get versus industry norms and the multiple and their exit. So you can appreciate that if that's their time horizon, 3 to 5 years, and to exit with a significant value creation, there's a heavy emphasis on cash management and how it's operationalized. But I would argue the most differentiating aspect of operating in private equity is the fact that these businesses are highly leveraged. That is, they take on a high level of debt. When the private equity companies buy a company, they're actually putting in a minority cash investment, and they seek the rest of the cash required from institutional lenders, who obviously do that to achieve value through interest payments on that, and ultimately refinancing when appropriate. So the debt to the annual EBITDA generated, the debt ratio, as it's referred to, can typically be 3 to 4 times debt versus equity, sometimes up to 6 times, much higher than public companies would generally have, and it can be even higher than this, although that gets very risky, and it carries with it a high expectation of EBITDA growth in order to service the debt, because debt service through interest, regular interest payments, becomes one of the largest uses of cash that's generated, which is again quite different. So this makes for a much different focus. The investors are very interested that cash generation is sufficient, so that it avoids them having to put more money in or potentially defaulting on the debt. And then when you think about the stakeholder base, it's a much narrower stakeholder base. Rather than thousands of shareholders, you generally have one majority private equity owner who controls the board, with a few minority players owning equity. It can be a little different. I can tell you that in my initial experience managing this company, I had 2 private equity owners that were 50-50, which is quite unusual and makes for its own interesting challenges. It requires that they're very aligned and collaborative, and it requires some additional thoughtfulness on how to manage them, and it requires strong relationships with the key sponsor at each of those companies. But generally speaking, there's one majority equity owner, but there's also strong lender interest. They've actually got more cash at stake, and hence the reporting and connection requirements within the lenders is equally as important as with the equity owners, which results in a whole different set of activities. And then lastly is the management ownership stake. In this particular case, the key management own equity, whether it's through a restricted stock scheme or other. The idea there, though, is that you are simpatico with the equity owners, have the same interests, but the vesting of the management's equity has both a time-based and a multiple aspect depending on how successful or how much value is created at exit. But nothing, it's not worth anything until there is a transaction through the sale to another company or through a significant shift in equity ownership, which causes a liquidation event. So as background, those to me are stark differences in terms of how we grew up managing the business within P&G and now moving to a private equity environment. So given the contrast, I wanted to share my experience and sort of how it plays out. First of all, in the recruiting, as private equity companies seek to recruit leadership for their companies. In many cases, they're investing in a founder-led company, but in just as many others, they're looking to ultimately put in leadership to manage the company through their time horizon and through their liquidation event. So they have, I would argue, very strong respect for P&G experience. The quality of the training, the diversity of consumer market experience, the high standards and high principles, I think, really carry the day with those investors. I'm just gonna, Ileana, have I lost this?
Yes. Well, we can see your screen, but we can see, there you go.
That back? Okay. So in any case, there's a high respect for that, but I would be transparent with you that they're also wary of bringing, directly from P&G in large roles supported by, significant infrastructure directly into their environment, where one's got to do more with less, operate, frankly, lean and fast, and learn to be in this high leverage environment where cash is king. So you'll often hear recruiters and private equity folks themselves talk about that they really like that P&G +1 consideration, and that is where a P&G person has had at least one business experience after P&G where they've had to cope with less infrastructure, maybe less bench strength and the requirement to recruit on their own, and operating with less cash reserves. For my own experience, I did have that opportunity for a P&G +1, which was a privately held company, not a privately equity company, a much different business model, and one that was definitely much starved in talent, which challenged me to learn how to network and recruit and bring in people, frankly, attract people to the opportunity, and build, a really strong world-class kind of management team, on my own, so to speak, but before having that exposure to private equity. So there is that stigma, frankly speaking, that you will find given some of these differences. Moving into the speed aspect, there is just an expectation, with a shorter time horizon to some kind of an exit, a speed of decisions and actions, and frankly, a simplicity and an expectation of simplicity to really boil down the core value drivers and what needs to be done. From my own experience, I came into this business when the equity sponsors were already about 1.5 years into their investment. So the time horizon was theoretically even shorter. And it was clearly at a moment of inflection for the industry, and the business was certainly under fire, where the company was behind in adapting to the shift in retail away from department stores to mass, well behind in e-commerce, getting marginalized because of that, and so the need for speed to recalibrate the focus of the company, bring in talent in the capability areas that are required for new channels, new business models, new e-commerce, all of that was on fast play, if you like. But the other side of that is, these are lean environments where private equity hires the management team for their experience as much as anything else, and the expectation that they can play up and down. Very comfortable thinking strategically and big picture as to the key drivers and where the focus needs to be, but also quite willing to helicopter down and be involved in the day-to-day execution. For my own part, given the shift in retail, not only did I have to bring in some folks that were, much more well-versed in customer management on the mass side, but also in e-commerce, but to get personally involved in developing customer relations, visiting not only on a top-to-top basis, but frankly, going back to meeting and engaging with buyers, because in these industries, buyers are still primary decision makers. And so this notion of having a management team that is quite comfortable playing up and down, rolling up sleeves, not being kind of empire builders is critical, and you'll lose a lot of time if you don't have that. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples and where that's gone right and where that's gone wrong. Of course, the aspect of cash management, to really understand how cash works, I would argue is a new skill that has to be learned relative to maybe some of the big company experiences. And how to maximize cash, make sure every dollar is going against activities that are going to improve the value of the company, and avoid wastage, especially when so much of the cash needs to be used on a regular basis to service the debt, both and importantly in terms of interest, but also in terms of principal. But understanding the aspects of your receivables and the timing and collection thereof relative to investments in inventory and working capital. In this business, it's a largely seasonal business. About 65-70% of our business is related to the fall season. When you think about winter accessories, gloves, even slippers are highly seasonal, and then rain umbrellas are highly weather dependent. We sell a lot of umbrellas when it rains and not so much when it doesn't. It means that inventory management, working capital, is one of the areas that is the biggest tie-up of cash. And if you bet wrong and you end up with way too much cash tied into inventory that is still around a year later, that can be very, very limiting to the business. So understanding that and how to manage cash, both in terms of paying the debt and also managing working capital, comes even before you think about brand building and investment in technology and the like. Ileana, have we lost the screen again?
No, we're good.
Okay, good. I've lost it on my computer for a second, so just give me 1 second as I try to make sure I get it back. Oh, here we are. Okay. Apologize for that. And then talent management takes on another dimension. We tend to talk about, given the sort of flat network nature of athletes versus specialists. But first of all, when I'm trying to recruit and bring on new members to the team, I really try to understand what people's motivation is for getting involved in a smaller private equity portfolio company. We want to hire them because they've got the proven experience, so they can help us immediately. On one hand, we're not, the limited capacity to train people sort of greenfield. So we want people that already are proven in the areas that we need. But on the other hand, we want broad thinkers, folks that can stretch across functional areas and are very comfortable doing that, given the dynamics of the business, versus overly specialist. But more than anything, I really probe folks to make sure that not only are they interested in guiding the company's transformation and being involved strategically, but they actually like the cut and thrust and getting involved in the execution and making sure that we follow it right through. If they don't, they won't be happy, because that's the expectation, is we play up and down, and have this notion of player coaches, coaching, but also playing. We do look, and we bring in young folks with fresh ideas, especially when you think about the move to direct to consumer and digital. But we want them to be able to tap into the experience of our more senior managers, and we want them involved in the actual execution. It'll only make it better. And so, one comes in whatever stage you are at your career, you got to come in saying that's kind of what I want. For my own part, you can probably sense that's what I like most about my time at P&G, was being involved in those business situations, those dynamic situations, many cases where there wasn't necessarily a playbook, but it's not just the strategic part, but it's actually following it right through to the execution and the customer execution. So, we really do hire for that. At the same time, it's easy to make mistakes. Through the interview process, you try your best, and people sometimes think that's what they want, but we do find fit issues. I'll tell you, if you think about the whole emphasis on managing cash and debt, it's incredibly important, especially for a P&G trained person like myself, to have a CFO, Chief Financial Officer, who really can backstop you in these areas. And so you have to really recruit for that. But at the same time, you want a fellow strategist, you want somebody who has the operating discipline and so on. I can tell you that I feel blessed with a CFO who has probably a decade of that foundational blue chip CPG experience in a really terrific healthcare company. But then following that, had a number of experiences moving into smaller private businesses, but also private equity businesses, learning firsthand cash management, treasury side of the business, bank and lender management, and sponsor reporting. And I can tell you that kind of background has been incredibly helpful to me, especially if you think about the last several years, all of us have had to manage through. We've gone through a number of disruptions on this business. First, a business that was overextended because it didn't foresee the big changes at retail, and we had to restructure our debt, recapitalize the business, and I needed a very capable CFO partner to do that. And then right off the back of that, moving into the impact of the COVID pandemic, which anybody exposed to retail, particularly specialty retail, in this case department stores and the like, basically had to go without revenue for 5 months and figure out how to manage cash and adapt to that. Having a savvy, calm CFO with relevant experience was critical. And now, like many of us, we're into the next stage of that, which is a global supply chain disruption, which is the back end of the pandemic, requiring again a deft touch on how to manage inventory, working capital when things are not coming in on time, and the like. It's been a blessing to have somebody with that background. Without that background, I can tell you the business would be very, very challenged. We also have a very strong player. I'm delighted with a fellow P&G alumni running our U.S. business. And there again is a profile, an individual who probably spent the first 10 years of their career deep in retail selling, in the sales side of the business, actually carried the bag and met with buyers and went through all the persuasive selling and understanding customer strategies to adapt the pitch to win. And then later moved into marketing and brand building and fundamentals at a time when the marketing was starting to move direct to consumer, digital and the like, and really cut his teeth in that regard. Made him very adaptable and adept in this business where there's such a focus on retail and making the brands relevant for buyers and retailers, getting personally involved in that with such a shift in our customer base. Has turned out to be very, very successful, and successful also in leading the organization, if you like, to the new place that we've had to go. At the same time, we've had some misses, and I can reflect on bringing in what was a terrific on paper person to lead our sales organization, very deep in public CPG experience and advanced to very senior levels, but honestly had been a number of years removed from the day-to-day selling. And probably more comfortable simply staying at the strategy level, the deployment level, the measurement, and templating. But what we really needed was personal involvement with customers to shift our company's position with them. And ultimately, that's not a good or a bad on an individual basis. It's just a fit issue. But one of the things you'll hear many times in these talent changes is managers will wish that they made a talent change that wasn't a fit much earlier than they did. In this particular case, we had to move quickly and move on, and it's just It's just a requirement of this environment. There's not the same opportunity or luxury, if you like, to sort of train people over an extended period of time into that. You know, I would simply say, you know, the expectations of the private equity folks is a shorter term horizon, and hence, you know, the talent needs to be aligned in that regard too. It's particularly true at the early stages of the investment that you get the right team in place and identify investments that the private equity folks really need to put in to realize their vision, because they need to see that return within the time horizon that they hold the company. So again, all of that requires, I think, a pacing that is faster and is attuned to their objectives. So, you know, I give you that as a little bit of background. I'd also say that there's a whole different environment in terms of stakeholder management. You have here very smart, financially adept people in the private equity sponsor side. They've got a lot at stake, and so they expect to know what's going on very regularly, and for bad news to travel fast and be engaged quite regularly on the business priorities. It often means you've got young analysts asking lots of questions and diving into details. So it's important that, you know, you feel comfortable checking your ego, invite that involvement, right? And on the other hand, you know, be clear and firm on what you're doing and why. I mean, one still has to maintain their own personal vision on the business. You got to push back where it's appropriate, because at the end of the day, P&G sponsor, or the PE sponsors, are very smart, very financially adept, but they're not operators. That's why they hire folks to do the operating. They're the investors, and they need to be brought along, engaged. But if you listen too much to everything, you could be sunk with a lot of pet projects that get in the way of the most critical initiatives. So it does require an adept approach to really building relationships with them, getting on the same page in terms of the strategic priorities, and then using that to guide what gets done and what doesn't get done. So very different kind of relationship than the one we talked about and I described in the public company board experience, where there's much more of a emphasis on high-level strategy, the fiduciary and regulatory requirements, you know, government, talent, succession planning, and so forth. It's a bit of a different spin on it. So, you know, I just sort of put a pin in it there relative to my own experience. Again, I'm sure, like all of you, there is, you know, I'm very grateful for the kinds of experiences that I got at P&G and the kinds of training and mentorship that I got, and so much of it is sought after and I think so leverageable in whatever business you find yourself in. But this notion of adapting into private equity industry certainly, you know, for me has been an eye opener, and it's fun, but it is dynamic and requires a different pace of learning. And this whole area of learning how to do more with less and how to manage cash and debt is one of the most differentiating elements in it. So hopefully, if those of you who are interested in that side of it in some way, that's been helpful to you. For those of you who get directly involved in those discussions, I'm certainly happy to be a sounding board as it comes up. You know, wishing you all the best with that. I'll pause here, Ileana, and certainly open up to any questions that we have in the last number of minutes here.
That was like an impressive 101. Like, I feel like I just went through a full accelerator of, you know, everything you needed to know and keep in mind when jumping, you know, into this kind of industry, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that.
And again, I'm just going to say it's not a lecture because it's just my experience, you know, and everybody has different experiences.
Definitely, but a lot of, you know, rich points that you touched on that I think need to be taken into consideration. And we just have a couple of minutes. There's several questions that I have that, you know, the audience has, but I think that the most important one, or at least I believe, is you shared a lot of, you know, the things that we need to keep in mind as we, you know, think about if we're interested going into this industry. But for you specifically, in this transition that you went through, like, what do you think was the most helpful, in terms of either skills or values or attitudes that helped you move from P&G into private, or which ones did you find that you had to get rid of as you moved?
Well, there's a humility aspect, I would say, just off the top of my head in reaction to that. I would say, when I think back at my experience at P&G, and the thing that we can never stop doing is learning, right? And to really be effective learners, we have to have a certain amount of humility to both ask for help, right? And to be recognizing that we don't have all the answers. We got to go seeking them sometimes. I can remember my first experiences transferring from, R&D into brand, and thinking that, I knew how to do that work, and spending, literally 45 days straight being charged with writing a business review, and ultimately wrote something like a 60-page tome, only to be brought to task by my general manager for obviously not being sharp and thinking and not reaching out for help in the right time. And coming into this one as well, I think for me, the comfortable part was understanding brands, product development and innovation, retail. That was the comfortable part. But I've described to you what is less known to me, and that is what's important to the private equity sponsors. How do they measure success? And so developing a relationship with them, and having the necessary humility to sort of say you don't necessarily understand that, and asking for their help in understanding, debt structures, who the lenders are and why, rather than trying to put on an impression that you know it all already, to me was most important. And it certainly built credibility as well, which might be somewhat counterintuitive to folks, but I think it's really important. And like anything, it's your first 30, 60, 90 days where you have the opportunity to ask questions and be somewhat naive, because after that you're expected to get on with it and know what you're doing. I don't know, Juliana, if that answers the question, but that's kind of an initial reaction.
Yes, definitely does. Thank you. And one more question before we move to final comments. But we've seen leadership. Leadership has evolved through time. But now with COVID and with everything that has happened, also from a social justice perspective, how do you envision leadership, and especially in these more, not the big corporate environments, but where you have to be more fast-paced, more boots to the ground kind of, and in touch with younger generations that are demanding other needs. How do you see a leadership evolving, and things to keep in mind? I believe most of our audience are in that sort of like leadership position.
Well, I think that the need for participative leadership is only going up in that regard, right? The speed of change is only increasing. Change is a constant, and I think flattening organizations, so leadership is much closer to people in tackling problems, participating in those problems with them, is critically important. It doesn't take away any of the accountability or responsibility, but I do think the involvement has to change, recognizing that it's not always the same old answers, and new solutions are required. You want to help support that and take some of the risk out of it with folks. It's the other side of it is, I'll tell you that one of the biggest areas that I find myself wanting for is, we're in a very virtual world now, post-COVID, right? I mean, everybody sort of learned to move very virtual, and the move back to in-person is slow, and frankly slowed by continuing waves of it. And I think everybody recognizes we're never going back to the previous environment one way or another. It will be some kind of hybrid, and we've declared that irrespective of the pandemic, we're going to be in a hybrid environment where we want to help people be as productive as they can, have their work more integrated with their life, and have a better life balance. So we'll continue to promote virtual. You know, a certain amount of face-to-face in our business when it comes to product and interacting with product is required. But at the same time, for me, the gap has been, you know, I don't have the same walk-around opportunity to just informally chat about business with folks, to contribute to their coaching and so forth. So there needs to be a whole new sort of emphasis on finding new ways to engage with people informally, not just formally through all these, you know, video conferences, but informally through calls and connections, one-on-one, to just chat, you know, whatever the business or organizational, you know, question of the day is, without maybe necessarily trying to always drive to a resolution, but frankly, to offer the kind of coaching one would in the sort of management by walk around. And we're not there yet, but I think, you know, to me, that's going to be increasingly important, especially for younger people, for their training and development, for their cultural connection. I think that's a big question that we still need to answer.
Thank you so much. Any final remarks, words?
Well, no, I mean, I offer it in the spirit of one person's experience, but I also offer it, I think, like everybody on the phone, with great gratitude on you know, the sort of perspective that P&G gives us, not only in leadership lessons, but also a consideration of people and organizations. So I look forward to engaging with folks, you know, in any way I can be helpful, and also from learning from others as we go. But again, thanks for the opportunity to chat a bit about my own experience.
Thank you so much. There were also several comments about people that have worked with you in the past, just saying thank you for, you know, your leadership and your support to them during, you know, their experience working with you. So just wanted to let you know.
I remember it fondly, so thank you all. We had a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Let me go back to my slides just for the final words. I think I am showing my screen. Yes, I am. Perfect. Well, some additional announcements to make. Please join us, get involved, sign up for updates, pngalums.com, support our foundation, pngalumnifoundation.org, and partner with us at sponsor@pgalums.com. Also volunteer, start a chapter. This is a great community that we just keep growing and supporting each other. So don't, you know, feel free. It's 2022. We're starting into, you know, building more and being able to be more intentional in the work that we all do. So definitely don't be a stranger. Send us an email to hello@pngalums.com. All this recording will be available in our YouTube channel and and also in our website. And you can see there this recording and all our previous recordings where we've had really incredible speakers. So please make sure that you follow us there. And I want to invite you for next month with Tail Hayes, who is going to talk about allyship, the key to unlocking the power of active inclusion. So don't miss out on this great conversation. Dan, thank you so much again for being with us this morning. I appreciate it. And make sure that, you know, you touch with Dan if you're interested to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you.
Have a good one, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.